So it's the Old West. A cowboy walks into a bar, a saloon, goes up to the bartender and says, "Barkeep, give me a whiskey." And the bartender pours him a shot of whiskey, and the cowboy knocks it back. Says, "Give me another." As he's sipping on this next one, he turns around and he notices the saloon's completely empty. He looks at the bartender and he says, "Well, where is everybody on a nice day like this?" The bartender's polishing a glass and he looks at him and says, "Well, they're all up at the hanging." "The hanging," says the cowboy. "Well, who's the guest of honor?" Bartender says, "Well, it's old brown paper bag Pete." The cowboy shook his head and said, "Well, I've heard some strange names in my time, but I ain't never heard one like that. Why is he called brown paper bag Pete?" The bartender set the glass down and he says, "Well, look, it's like this. Old brown paper bag Pete is a strange feller. And the reason is because he always wore a hat made out of a brown paper bag. And not only that, he always wore a shirt made out of an old brown paper bag. But if that weren't strange enough, he even wore pants made out of a brown paper bag. And his boots, yeah, his boots too, they were made out of brown paper bags." The cowboy thought for a moment. He says, "Well, that's pretty much the strangest thing I've ever heard, but it doesn't seem like that's a hanging offense. And why the hanging him?" And the bartender leaned over and he said, "Rustling. Rustling. Get it? Rustling. Okay. Brown paper bag. Rustling. Stealing cows. Okay. This is, this is another one of my jokes. This is a story joke. I love story jokes. All right. But it's also a wordplay joke. And I keep talking about this stuff, but the way we use words, the words we choose, some of you got it, some of you didn't. Those of you who got it probably went, "Oh God, another one of those." But you get my point. Words are just wonderful. There's so much, and so today's lesson is all about listening, listening to words in particular, because it's a communications class. But there's a lot more to it than that. Now, obviously, in the announcement, I asked you to watch my introduction first. Then I also want you to watch uh, the video link that I posted from YouTube called Five. Let me look and make sure I have it right. Uh, 5 Ways to Listen Better by Julian Treasure. Now, I think that's just a wonderful name, Treasure. What more could you ask for? But Julian Treasure is a communications expert, and he specializes in studying the way we hear, the way we listen. And it's only a short video, it's 7 or 8 minutes long. So listen to that before you listen to me give my PowerPoint lecture. But I want to say a few things before you go watch the video and before you um, listen to my and watch my PowerPoint. And I started with a joke because jokes are engaging. They're the ways to get people's attention, and typically they'll listen to it. But uh, what exactly is going on with listening here? First of all, uh, we get the terms listening and hearing mixed up. They're really two different kinds of things. I would like to suggest, and there's a lot of strong research that I'm not making this up, that we hear all the time. And you say, wait a minute, but when I'm asleep, I don't hear anything. Ah, but you do. And it's all because of physiology and physics that we hear all the time. You know, I like science. So, physiology and physics. Well, what's going on here? Well, first of all, uh, let me start with the ear. The ear, or can you see there's a big one there? The ear is an amazing organ that we need to take care of and treasure, obviously. But the way it works, and I don't have a diagram for this, you don't need to remember this specifically, but the way it works is that when there's a sound, there's the eardrum, which I think almost everyone's familiar with, inside this ear canal, deep down in there. That's why you don't want to stick sharp things in your ear. But the eardrum vibrates a little bit. But it's what's going on behind the eardrum that's really interesting. Behind the eardrum, there's a whole set of tiny, tiny little bones, just amazing little things. And these little bones move back and forth when the eardrum vibrates. And in that area with the bones, it's filled with a liquid. That's why sometimes when, especially kids, get ear infections, that liquid presses up against the eardrum, causing this ear infection. It can be very painful. But under normal circumstances, those bones move up and down. The liquid is set into motion, and deep down inside your ear canal, back behind the eardrum, are a bunch of little hairs called cilia. And these things vibrate back and forth as the eardrum causes the bones to move back and forth. The point is then somehow the brain translates that into sound. Well, this is happening all the time. Even when you're sleeping, of course, when there's a sound somewhere in the house, then you get that vibration and your brain senses some kind of sound. Well, and again, just a little bit of science here. Of course, the reason for that is that sound is an actual vibration in the air. You know, if I clap my hands, I've created a sound wave. And so we're always experiencing these waves, sometimes sharp ones like the clap that I just did, and sometimes very, very subtle, but it's always there. We're hearing 100% of the time. And again, think about sleeping. Um, the whole process of sleeping, your alarm clock wouldn't work, of course, to get you up if you weren't hearing all the time. So we hear 100% of the time, but this is passive. We're not trying to hear, it just happens. So we hear all the time, 100% of the time. I'll say a little bit more about that, or at least reinforce this in the PowerPoint lecture as well. Well, what about listening? What do I have in my notes about listening? Ooh, look at this. According to my notes, uh, we actually have to think about to listen. We have to we have to want to pay attention, if you like, and listen to make sense of what we're hearing. Oh, and there's an example. My clock just went off, so you all heard that. But we don't actively, and that's the difference. Hearing is passive, listening is active. We're really genuinely trying to make sense out of what we're hearing at any given time. And when we're awake, we're actively listening, uh, and these are rough numbers, about 60% of the time. But here's the kicker. We only retain what we actively listen to about 25% of what we listen to. That's what we actually remember or pay attention to enough that we process it. So passive listening 100% of the time, 60% of the time when we're awake, about that we're actively listening, but we only remember about 25% of that. Part of what's going on here, and this happens, oh my God, this happens all the time, especially when you're in class. It's tough to pay attention, to actively listen for long periods of time. Now, I did a little Google search, of course, on the internet just to see what I could come up with. And according to one website, and I'm going to say I didn't check this out, I just found this. Microsoft did a study on the average adult attention span, and it turns out to be a whopping 8 seconds. 8 seconds? Wait a minute. You can pay attention longer than that, can't you? Well, what this study, and I've seen this number elsewhere, what this study seems to be indicating is that we're constantly having to refocus. And why is that? Well, Uh, this is where my expertise are a little bit limited, but I have read that part of the reason that our attention span is only 8 seconds, and I'll elaborate on this in a moment, is that, and I'm going to call that the refocusing attention span, the 8 seconds, in that we constantly are being bombarded by these passive sounds coming to us. Also, there seems to be an evolutionary reason for this, in that as a survival skill, we're constantly listening to, well, maybe the tread of that saber-toothed tiger coming up behind us. So we're constantly listening to or hearing sounds, and we're fighting from active to passive listening. When it really comes down to an adult attention span, however, a lot of studies have shown that the average adult attention span, taking into this account of this sort of 8 second refocusing, okay, it's there, but that it's about 20 minutes. Now that makes more sense to me. About 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, we start experiencing listener fatigue, don't we? Oh my gosh, especially in a lecture, and so on. And so after 20 minutes, we're ready to move on to something else, or we have to do a major effort to refocus and continue listening to Ray carry on for more than 20 minutes. There's even a rule of thumb, as it's called the 20-minute speaker guide. In other words, if you're ever asked to give a presentation somewhere, a speech, perhaps go over something at work with your colleagues, keep it to 20 minutes or a little bit less, because that's a real attention span. So those are some of the things to think about. As I said, this is just my brief introduction to what you're going to hear in the video by Julian Treasure, the 5 ways to listen better, and then in my PowerPoint. So listening is a skill. It's part, especially as college students, you know that it's a skill, and there's different kinds of listening, as you'll find out here in just a little while. So there we go. That's my brief introduction, and we'll move on from here. So again, please watch the YouTube video, Julian Treasure, 5 ways to listen better, before you watch my PowerPoint, because I refer to the contents of that video in my PowerPoint. All right, so here we go. I hope you liked the joke. I got more, so we'll see where we go from there. All right.